So here it is, my row cardigan. I have all of the pieces complete except for the collar and the front facings, which I'll do after I finish the seams. This particular sweater has a set-in sleeve, so I thought that I would go ahead and take a minute and explain how to do what I call the perfect set-in sleeve. Now, a set-in sleeve has a shaped sleeve cap. So basically what that means is you get this funny little shape for a set-in sleeve, and it sets into the hole that you've created by shaping your armholes. Now on this particular cardigan, the front and back shaping were the same. They're both 8 inches long. Sometimes you will find that the front will actually be longer than the back, and what that does is that moves the seam from the top of the shoulder slightly back towards the shoulder blade, which is a common fashion industry thing. In home knitting patterns, you're not going to see it quite as much unless you have a designer that's gone to fashion school, and then they're more likely to set that seam a little bit further back. But for this one has a center seam, so it sits right at the top of your shoulder, and that makes it a little bit easier to set in a sleeve. Now, when you're talking about setting in a sleeve, we're talking about mattress stitch. Yes, you can whip stitch this together, you can crochet it together, you could probably even Bickford seam it. But for me, I like the stability and the almost invisibleness of a mattress stitch. So that's what I use. And when I say almost invisibleness, you can see in my shoulder seam, which is right here, there's a little bit of a buckle, mostly because I have not blocked my seams yet. And I always block my seams. I also block each and every piece before I seam it, because you want to make sure that you still have some flexibility in your seams. But with this one, you can kind of tell there's something there. There's a weird little jog, but you can't really say, oh, there's a seam there. A knitter or somebody who's done this a lot would say, oh, there's a seam there. But if a designer is worth their salt and you're paying attention when you're doing a sweater like this, your cables almost become seamless and they bleed one into the other. And I do say part of that is the design, part of that is the knitter. So on this one, for me, I had to knit 8 3/4 inches for my my shoulder, or for my my armhole, and I did the back first. So what I did was I took note of where that was in my repeat, which row number it was when I did the final decreases for the sleeve cap, or for the top of the shoulder. And I made sure that I stopped in the exact same place, or as close to the exact same place as I could on the fronts, so that everything was symmetrical. To me, symmetry is pretty important. And on this side, I may have even done it just a little bit better. I'm not quite as off on this side as I was on the other side. Now, as you can see, I've already got one sleeve in. So this is my sleeve, all right? My sleeve cap, and you can still see, like, I haven't blocked anything yet, so there's a little bit of a crinkle there. But my seam isn't obvious. It looks like it's part of the pattern. And the big thing is you want to make sure that you're preserving this kind of rounded shoulder, even though your sleeve cap is not round. It's going to be blocky and funny because of the way that you bind off as you go. But you can indeed make a square peg fit in a round hole in this particular instance. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you how I do it. I'm not going to say it's the best way because nobody would agree with that particular statement. I am going to tell you that, in my opinion, this is the most professional way to do it. So if you want nice looking seams and you want your sleeve to fit just perfect, this is probably the way that you want to go. Now, if you notice, I have not sewn up my side seams. Okay, you can, of course, sew these up and then fit your sleeve cap into the actual hole, the armhole. However, it's really hard to get it to match up properly because rarely is your armhole and your sleeve cap the exact same size. And the reason why is because you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. There's some easing in and there's some flexing to make it work. So I have always found, whether it be a knitted project or a sewing project, that it is best to wait to do the side seam until after your sleeve is set in. Because you're going to set your seam in this way, or you're going to set your sleeve in this way. And I know what you're thinking, that does not work in any way, shape, or form. But it does. It does, it does, it does. Why? Because when you match your corners up, where you bound off initially to shape the underarm, you'll notice that this is wide enough to go that far, but this looks like it's a little too tall. It's not. What's going to happen is this is going to come up here. And then these are going to come out to here, and voila, look at that. It's darn near perfect. Now I do know, because I've already done one, that there is a slight discrepancy between the sleeve height and the armhole. So you have to futz just a smidge. And if you don't know how to do mattress stitch, go and learn how to do mattress stitch and get comfortable with it first. If you've done it a few times, you can totally do this. All right, I'm gonna show you how. I'm gonna walk you through. Now, you will notice that I have not woven in my ends. I do that at the end when there's mattress stitch or when there's seams involved, because you can weave your ends into the seam and you kind of have a little less work to do. But as I said, each one of these pieces has been washed. It has not been blocked to size. The yarn that I used, which is Jagger Spun Moosom Falls in the color Hazelnut, I believe. Let's see. Which one do I have? Yep, Hazelnut. This comes, I buy it on a cone. And generally cone yarns will come waxed or treated in some way to make them easier to weave with or to machine knit with. And all of Jagger Spun's yarns that you get on a cone come waxed. So I like to make sure that I've removed that wax before I start seaming things up. It just helps the fabric to bloom a little bit and just loosen up a smidge. And I also, this being a superwash wool, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to lose the definition in my cables when I washed it. Because when all is said and done, this is going to go in the washing machine for me because it's superwash. It can. And then I'll lay it flat to dry. I don't generally put things like this in the dryer. But I do like to use the washing machine if for no other reason than the spin cycle to get most of the moisture out. And then I can hang it if I want. If I need it to be a little longer, I can let gravity do that for me. But anyways, back to your sleeve cap. Now, there's a couple of tools that you need to do this appropriately. Obviously, you need your yarn, okay? You're going to need a tapestry needle or a yarn needle. I like the bent tips. I find that that just makes it way easier to grab the amount of stitches that you actually need than trying to use something that's straight and kind of wiggling it in. This just works better for me. The other thing that I suggest, and you don't have to do this, is to not knock things over when you reach for things, is sewing pins. All right. Now I have a bunch of oddball things in this bowl because it's a magnetic bowl. And I say that and things fall out. Yeah. These little plastic doodads are for blocking, and a few of them landed here. They need to go back with the other ones. But these are the pins that I typically use for blocking, so I have a lot of T-pins in here. I also have some screws and some stitch markers, and you know, a magnetic bowl is just handy for so many things. Let me get these guys out of here because it'll make it easier. I also put sewing pins in here, like the little itty bitty ones, but I always leave the thread on them so that I can find them again. Because I always know that there's at least one in this bowl, so when I can't find any of my other 500, I know that there are some in this bowl. Why pins? All right. Pins are so that you know how much futzing you need to do. If there is a massive discrepancy, and I mean, when I say massive, an inch or so, between the height of your sleeve cap and the length of your armhole opening, you're going to have to do a little bit of trickery, so to speak. You're going to have to pick up more stitches on one side than you do on the other to perform your mattress stitch. And what invariably happens when you wing it is you don't realize that until you're about here. And then you're trying to make all of that extra fabric fit into a very small section, and you end up with puckering and buckling and just a really uncomfortable underarm seam. So we want to spread that out over the entire distance instead of trying to put it all into a small space. So how do you figure out what you need to do? All right, so first things first, you're going to find your seam right in the middle. Now, you're going to notice that I'm doing this in my lap, and this is often how I do it. You can also use an ironing board. The narrow end that's used for pressing sleeves or shoulders on a dress shirt works very well for this, because you can move and twist and kind of arc your fabric as you're doing this, and it helps to just set it in a little bit better. Now, we already know that my center seam is actually the center of the shoulder. And I have a piece of yarn that's still attached from doing that center seam, because as I said, I'll weave that in later. But the other thing you need to find is the center on your sleeve cap. And to do that, it's very simple. Just fold it in half. Okay, fold it in half, give it a little squeeze, find center. Okay, so center for me is right about there. So I'm going to match that stitch up with this seam. Heavier on one side than I am on the other, so this is a little tricky to do on camera. So that goes there. And then I'm going to take a single pin and I'm going to pin it this way, so vertically. That's just a placeholder. It's just making sure that I don't shift left or right while I'm doing the rest of this, because you still have the ability to skew a little bit. So the first thing that you want to do is get this top bind off secured. You want that in the fabric as best as you can. So you just kind of grab it and put a pin in it. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So grab the two layers, bring them together, and put a pin in. And you really want to make sure that you're grabbing the edge of your bind off here, that corner that you get, and securing that. All right, so now this pin is useless. I don't need it anymore, because all it was doing was making sure that I didn't swivel left or right. Now the next thing that you want to do is get your end of your seam secured. So we're going to grab this bind off for the underarm, which is on the armhole opening, and then this bind off for the sleeve cap, and match those up and put a pin in it. Now, if you have the plastic or bamboo knitters pins, those work just fine. I do a lot of blocking with T-pins, so I have a bunch of those, so that's what I use. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. Match those sides and get a pin in it. Again, you want to make sure that on your edges you're very secure, so that you don't end up with a 1 or 2 stitch discrepancy in your underarm, because it will create a little bit of a hole there when you're doing your seams later. All right, so now we know this is our end, this is our beginning. So if we grab it and we pull it up, you'll see they kind of sort of match. They don't match exactly, and that's okay. They will. As you start getting your seam in there, you'll start to manipulate and stretch and move the sleeve cap so that it does in fact fit perfect. And there we go. Now I'm putting my pins pretty close together because this is a worsted weight material. It's a little heavier, so you tend to get a little more gapping, which can make it difficult to do your mattress stitch between pin pulls when you pull your pins out. Okay, so again, we're just going to kind of give it a little stretch and get everybody in line and pin up this side. Now I'm not going to pin the sleeves or the side seam. I don't need to do that just yet. But we are going to set ourselves up so that we're only using one piece of yarn to do all of these seams. And I'll show you how to do that, because that is kind of the most important bit of the way that I do this. So here we go. I got a whole bunch of pins in here. All right, so watch your fingers if you're using a T-pin or a sewing pin, because, you know, they're sharp. Just kind of be aware that they're there. You're probably less likely to actually hit them than you think you are, unless you're accident prone. I mean, I tend to be a bit of a klutz, so it's entirely likely that I will poke myself several times on this. Okay, so now that you've got your sleeve all pinned out, now what? Well, now you just need to start your seams. Okay, and you're going to start your seams right in the middle here. And I know what you're saying. Why would I start it up there? Why don't I start it over here and do the whole thing? Well, for two reasons. One, if you start in the middle and work this way, then any discrepancy is going to be in the underarm. You don't want a funky pucker through the shoulder. And then you're going to come this way and the same rules apply. You're also going to end up with two pieces of long yarn in your underarm when this seam is done, because this and this are your underarms. So you're going to have a tail and a tail there. One of them is going to seam your sleeve, and the other one is going to do your side seam. And if you do it the right way, you won't have any holes or any weird bunching in your underarm. And that, to me, the underarm seam is the most important seam. You can have kind of a bulky shoulder seam, and over time that's going to flatten out, wear down, it's going to shape to your body. A bulky, puckered, bunched up underarm sleeve seam means that you're probably not going to wear the sweater. It's going to be uncomfortable rubbing up against your underarm, regardless of if you have something on underneath the sweater or not. It's going to be funny rubbing there. And you're just not going to wear the piece, and therefore the seam is never going to relax and even out and flatten out. So set yourself up for success from the beginning. It may seem a little convoluted to do it this way, but it's going to make a lot of sense as we actually operate. So obviously now you need your yarn, and you're going to need a really long piece of yarn, because you want to do this whole seam and then your whole side seam from hem to fingertip. So you're going to want about 6 feet of yarn, depending on the size of your sweater. Okay. So for me, that's about my wingspan. So I will generally just hold it, spread my arms out, and then give myself twice that. So I'm sorry. I'm going to take about 12 feet here, a little bit over, because my last one ran not short, but close to short, and it was scary at the end. So the next thing that you want to do is take this really long piece of yarn and fold it in half. Okay, so find your two ends, put them together, and then find the center. Okay, center, because we're starting in the center and we're going to need a piece to go left and a piece to go right. Now, in order to keep this relatively even, you want to put a slip knot here. You can do an overhand knot, but don't do it so tight that you can't get it undone, because this is going to be sitting on the outside of your sleeve if you do that. So I do a slip knot, and when I do the second side, I just remove it. So now we're going to take one end and go ahead and thread ourselves up. And I'm using a pretty big tapestry needle here because this is worsted weight. Okay, so starting your mattress stitch. I've watched dozens of videos on this, and there's something that seems to be the norm that drives me nuts. And that is when they start from the back side of the fabric and they come through. Why? Why do they do that? This entire seam is worked from the front side of the fabric. So start on the front side of the fabric. So all I'm going to do is grab, so here's my seam. I'm going to grab the stitch to the left of where center is. Now this is a bind off, so you want to make sure that you're getting the entire stitch. Should be 2 legs, and sometimes it's tricky to see if you have 2. You just want to make sure that you've got all the bulk there. And I am right up against, there's my bind off, there's the stitch below the bind off, and I'm right in there. So there's my first one, there's my slip knot. That's going to keep me from pulling more than I actually should be pulling. I'll pull the first pin out and flip to this side and grab the first stitch here. Now, so we are doing bind off against a row of an edge, so to speak. So a long edge against a short edge, rows versus stitches. And this can get a little tricky because your stitches are longer than they are wide. So what you want to do, I do a 1-to-1 across the top of the shoulder. So pick up 1 stitch on the bound off edge from your sleeve cap. And then 1 stitch from the edge here. Now, if the designer is worth their salt, especially in a pieced cabled sweater, you should have a selvage stitch on either side that's always done in stockinette. If they did not give you one of those and you're patterning edge to edge, give yourself a selvage stitch, because it just makes it easier to do your seams, because that's the stitch you're sacrificing anyways. And I'll tell you, trying to seam moss stitch to moss stitch is tricky. Your eyes go buggy very, very quickly if there isn't a selvage stitch. Now this particular designer did do a selvage stitch, and I'm greatly appreciative of that. So we're just going to work our way down to the corner here. Okay, so when you get to 1 stitch before your edge of your bind off for your sleeve cap, that's when you're going to start working down the edge, because that edge stitch is the one that gets sacrificed for the mattress stitch. I keep poking myself on that pin. I knew I was gonna. Okay, but the first thing I want to do is go ahead and tighten this down. And I want to get that tail out of my way. Okay, so when you're tightening down your mattress stitch, get in there and pinch your fabric really tight in your right hand or your left hand if you're left-handed, and give it a tug. Now that one behaved. I'm going to eventually find one that doesn't, and when I do, I'm going to show you how to deal with one that doesn't behave, because it happens where it doesn't tighten, where you get stuck. Now I like enough space to get my hand actually in between the fabric and hold it that way. So now every once in a while you want to check and just make sure that somebody's not bigger than the other. And as you can see, if I pull tight, I've got a gap still between, which means that I've got more stitches on the back than I do on the front, or this is just a little bit longer. So what I'm going to do is only pick up one stitch on the front edge and then pick up 2 stitches on the back edge. And then I'll do 2 and 2, and then 1 and 2. You don't want to cluster your fixes, your fudging all together. Give them a little space. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a pucker. And that's precisely what we're trying to avoid. So pick up 1. 2. 2. And 2. And I'll tighten this down and see where we sit. Again, pinch that back side and give it a tug. Now, if you tug too far and you feel the place that you've already tightened down start to move, it's perfectly okay to grab both sides of that seam and give it a tug and open it back up a little bit. Because what happens is, even though you have all of these loops going back and forth, when you tighten down, you make that yarn straight. And it is literally just going back and forth between the 2 sides of the fabric. So you have the ability to loosen this back up if you make it a little too tight, but you don't want it too loose. And yes, that's a thing, where it's so loose that your seams are longer than the rest of your sweater. It happens, folks. Okay, so now let's see where we're at. Now we're in a better place. That gap is not nearly so big. So I'm going to go 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. Just all the way down the edge now. And I do check mine every time I tighten, because I want to know if there is a discrepancy. And the only way to know that is by checking. Now, if you can see, what's happening here is this is already starting to go round where it wasn't before. So this is the sleeve cap, this is the armhole opening, and this is kind of rolling in on itself a little bit right now, and they will until you actually force that seam to lay flat. Once you force it to lay flat, it completely changes the way that it looks. And when I say force it to look flat, once you block it. Now, as I said, I washed these pieces. They are not blocked to size, but they are loose enough that I don't have to worry about my seams being tighter than the rest of my sweater. Because if this needs to stretch at all, it's going to be horizontally across my bust line, not vertically down. I know the sleeves are the right length, the body's a smidge short, but once it's washed, it'll even out. And I wanted to wear this with high-waisted jeans anyways, so having it be a smidge short is perfectly fine. So now we're in the underarm bind off, and we're going to do those exactly the same as we did the top, just picking up both legs of a single stitch. And you're going to stop one stitch from the edge. So you're not going to try and go off the edge here, because these edges are going to get folded around and become your underarm. Now some people think that you have to sew these in the round and match up your two edges underneath the underarm and fight your sleeve to do that. I've never seen a difference personally. I've never had a problem with it, but okay. So this one I've made rather long. It's probably going to give me problems, and it did. So if you're tugging and it feels like you're going to break your yarn before it actually slides, what's most likely happened is two strands have gotten crossed. So you've got somebody stuck in the one that you're trying to pull. So the easiest way to fix that is to find the loop that's standing up that's next and give that a tug. Now sometimes what you'll find is it wants to close the rest of this. And that, you know what, that's perfectly fine. I actually don't mind doing it that way. mostly because it does make your life a little easier, but that one's only going to go so far. So this one, the other side, is the one in question. And now that it's sliding free, give that a tug and you're good to go. And I know that I've got another one right here. Uh-oh, that looks like a split piece. If you've split your yarn, you may have bigger issues. And that looks to be exactly what, nope, I didn't. When I say split your yarn, what happens is your needle goes through your yarn. And if that happens, you got bigger issues. You're probably going to have to break the yarn and rejoin it. It sounds worse than it is. It's a nuisance, but it's not difficult. All right. So my biggest issue here is that I've just made this too long. And usually with worsted weight, I have a 1-inch rule, but I was in a zone and I was going. So I let it go a little further than I should have, and as a result, I'm having issues pulling through at this point. There we go. So there's that. Now let's see if I can get that slack out. There we go. And it's perfectly okay to grab your seam and kind of open it up a little bit and just make sure that you've actually pulled all the slack out. Because sometimes it feels like you have, but up towards where you stopped the previous time, you may have more slack than you realize. All right, so there we go. There's that side. And I'm just going to finish off these couple of stitches here by giving them a tug and take my needle out because we're going back to the top. So there you go. That's half of a sleeve cap there. Looks quite nice if I do say so myself. Now again, this section right here, this 1 inch or so, is your underarm. So that's going to fold under and become your underarm. And I said before that some people get really funny about those underarms. Here's the one on the side that I completed. So here's the underarm. And you can see there's no weird bulk or the fabric itself doesn't look funny because I did it on the outside and then flipped it towards the inside because you're still working from the stitches the exact same way regardless of how you do it. So do it however you're comfortable. This just happens to be the way that I like. So when you get back to your top, you're probably most comfortable working in a specific direction. So for me, I always like to go from right to left. So I'm going to flip this over so that I can actually do that. My yarn's over here. All of my pins are now on the wrong side. And that's okay. I'll remove them as needed. Again, just thread your needle. And get started. Now I started over here in this edge on the previous round. So I'm going to start over here. And if you notice, I'm not actually doing my seam. I'm just going to allow the edge of my seam to fold down into the new seam. And it won't cause any issues. If I end up with a hole there, I will whip stitch that together, but it's highly unlikely because there's so much bulk right there on that edge that it causes any problems. Worsted weight is probably not my favorite thing to do seams in, but changing your yarn size to do your seams it doesn't make a difference because it's not the yarn that you're seaming with that determines the bulk of the yarn, the bulk of the seam. It's the yarn that you knit with. Come on. Hush. Hey, let's just start. So you're just going to repeat this all the way to your other edge, and then you're going to have 2 strands of yarn sitting in your underarms. Okay, so when you fold this in half, one side comes up your sleeve, the other one goes for your side seam, and voila, you're done. And you have a perfect set and shoulder. Always try on your sweater as soon as you join your 2 sides in the underarm. Do mattress stitch for about 1 inch in either direction, either down the sleeve or down the side. And then try it on and just make sure that there's no funkiness in that shoulder seam. And when all is said and done, if it's a yarn that you can wash in the washing machine, then put it in the washing machine. If it's not a yarn that likes vigorous washing, you can iron your seams with a good steam iron or even a garment steamer, which tends to be what I use, just to flatten that seam and relax it a little bit. It'll help with any tightness in that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you're a patron, my Patreon link is in the description. Feel free to get requests in for other videos.